Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.
to be all together in the rooms, you guys can also keep time as well too. You should have a timekeeper to be keeping time, but we'll use this as our official time. Good. Okay, perfect. Well, I welcome you to round 2 of the online WSDC, the Aztec division. I'm very excited to welcome my other judges here as well too. I've got Matt Hazel, and I've got, where's my other judge? I think it's Brett. Oh, did he make it in?
Yeah, I'm in here.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So Brett Peter. And we were supposed to also have a trainee judge. Did he make it on? It should have been Nawan. No, I don't see him on here. That's okay. Let's get started anyways. Just a reminder, of course, that if something happens to your connection and the call is dropped, we will stop time and we will give you, we will seek to get you back connected into the call. We've been told that after 5 minutes, if you aren't connected, we call an adjudication member to come in. And if after 10 minutes, then we move into the Ironman rules. But we are going to do everything we possibly can to keep you all connected into the call. Without further ado, I call upon the first speaker from Side Proposition to open the debate. Here.
Is everybody able to hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
I'll just timer. This debate is not about how much power opposition parties have, because on both sides, they do not have power in parliament. This debate is how to best open the eyes of citizens and the international community who have been blind for years of the decline in their democracy. I'm going to give you a 3-point case. Firstly, on how we increase international pressure. Secondly, on how we increase internal pressure. And Lucas will tell you how opposition parties seem less legitimate if they work in the existing less democratic framework. But before I do that, let me set up the debate. Because how does a boycott actually look? We think it looks like an opposition party that thinks a certain election is rigged. And the reason I think this is often because past elections have been rigged for years. For example, Turkey has opposition parties that have been participants in years and years, even though elections have been obviously rigged for a couple of years. We would rather have them say, we boycott this election as a whole. That means they say to their voters, you should not vote in this election at all. This goes for all opposition parties in the countries. But when do we then think opposition parties are likely to use this measure? We think they only do so if they're absolutely sure an election is going to be rigged. Why? 2 reasons, but before I move on to the reasons, let me give up your why.
Do those parties still run in those elections?
No, they don't. Do not. They say, we do not run, you should not vote at all. 2 reasons why this only happens if parties are absolutely sure the election is rigged. Firstly, if it's not rigged, that means they could have gotten power in that election in the first place. If they step out of the election at all, it means they have absolutely no power. We think if you're not sure it's absolutely rigged, it's always better to take the gamble and look if they can become part of parliament. But secondly, if it turns out it's not rigged and they still boycott, we think they lose out of reputation, therefore lose out on all power in their country. This means this boycott will only happen if the democracy in a country is already failing and the election could never have been won in the first place. What does this mean for the debate? The comparative is that there's no power for opposition parties on either side of the house. For example, in Russia, since 2007, there has been no opposition party policy passed in parliament. We will explain why working inside a system completely possessed by one party is worse than altering the system from the outside. But lastly, before I move into my substantive, what do these countries then actually look like? We think we're talking about countries with a failing democracy, such as Turkey, such as Hungary, such as Venezuela. However, even in those countries, I think a party that is in power wants to see democratic for their people and for the international community, because they're not strong enough to hold on to power without public and international support. The reason for this is the way that countries fall back into dictatorship is slowly altering the system from the inside. For example, in Syria, the Assad regime took 15 years to turn the country into a dictatorship. We think it's not one not one tipping point, but a slowly turning a system into a non-democratic system. The reason for that is why pointing a problem without radical action is problematic. Let's move on to my first argument on international pressure. We think you can only get international pressure if opposition parties boycott. Two reasons for that. Firstly, I think the media in international countries often don't cover elections in other countries because it simply doesn't seem interesting. We often only hear the result of an election, not how the election actually happened. But secondly, it doesn't seem like a big problem if an opposition party participates in the system. Because they're still a participant, it probably isn't a dictatorship, because why would a dictator ever allow an opposition party to run in the first place? But thirdly, even if a media covers, we don't think an election is an interesting topic to cover on, because it often consists of very small actions from different individuals. However, a boycott is a tipping point. It's one big action that catches immediate attention because it happens so rarely, because it's such a radical move. We therefore think it gets the pressure and the coverage needed in order for international communities to stand up. The reason they're likely to give this international pressure is because Western countries often want to oppose democracy. It's the reason why, for example, I have the UN, who advocates for democracy all around the world. What does this pressure then look like? We think it looks like sanctions, general sanctions, for example, trade embargoes, but also targeted sanctions. For example, freezing the account of dictators, such as happened when the UK denied Maduro access to the Venezuelan gold reserve. But secondly, it looks like endorsing opposition leaders, such as recognizing Guaido as the president of Venezuela, saying that is who we support. Thirdly, it looks like threatening with military action if protesters are harmed on the streets. What is the impact of all of this? We think countries with failing democracies often need international support because they lack the power and total control in their own country to do without the international community. At the moment we have this international community, we force more transparency and more democracy to be inside these countries, such as happened in Armenia in the early 2000s, where they became more democratic after a boycott, and then the international community pressured them into becoming the fully functioning democracy they now are. Second argument, how we get more internal pressure. We think the public often believes their own country is a democracy. Why? Firstly, we think the media is totally controlled by the state, meaning there's no evidence that points out how extremely undemocratic certain countries are, because there's no coverage on that. Because everything that you learn from the news is owned by the exact same state that alters the elections. But secondly, we think there's an optimism bias. Often people are proud of the country they are born in. Often they are the ones who voted that party in the first place, and therefore they don't want to believe that everything is wrong. However, and then moreover, we think every election proves that the country is democratic. Because why would you have an election if there's a dictatorship? Of course, it must be good because we were able to vote, because we had multiple boxes to click yes. We therefore need a boycott to tell the public it's a dictatorship. Why? Firstly, we think it's way easier to see a turnout rate who is dramatically low at the moment. All people who wanted to vote for an opposition party don't turn out. Why? We think opposition parties are able to report on that, but the opposition can't count a ballot. So if it happens inside the election, the only one who's able to see the actual result are the parties in power. Or with a voter, you can simply count the people on streets. But secondly, we think it's way easier to see an empty voting booth than it is to know who exactly voted on what. But secondly, we think there's only one option at the moment you vote, meaning that people only have one box to click on. We think first, that means for themselves, it intrinsically feels extremely wrong, because you know that it can never be a democracy if your only option is to vote for something. But secondly, it leads to people asking for a delay in that election. We think in a majority of cases this won't be granted because the dictator wants to keep in power, meaning people themselves already know that the only party who is there is a failing democracy. But even if it's granted, we think you get extreme leverage to be present in the counting and have more coverage on the election itself, which will Lucas expand on. Okay, what is then the impact of all of this? We think at the moment the public sees the problem in their country, they're more likely to protest, they're more likely to put internal pressure. Two reasons why we likely think this is likely to work. One, we think in those countries, because it's not yet a total democracy, the present party has no full control. I mean, at the moment you have a public uprising, you're more likely to fail to hold on to power. But secondly, we think often it leads to these dictators feeling scared, fearing international backlash. I mean, they're more likely to give it away, as happened, for example, in Ukraine in 2014, where after a Putin puppet election was boycotted and later overthrown. For all these reasons, I beg you to propose.
Okay, I thank the speaker for their remarks. I now call upon the first speaker from side opposition to open the opposition case.
Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes. Terrific.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. By refusing to participate in elections, opposition parties ultimately legitimize ruling government to the extent that they allow them to demonstrate their powers, to use strong rhetoric, right, by promising, popularity and criticizing that other parties don't even want to run against them. Today on Team Opposition, we believe that opposition parties should participate in these elections, but they should contest the results when they believe that they weren't actually fair, right? This looks like them announcing that they don't consider fair, right? Publicly denouncing the party that's currently in ruling government, right? Or even taking legal action through the courts of that country and trying to prove that these elections themselves weren't actually legitimate. You're going to be hearing three things from us today. First, about how we basically undermine, the belief in the democratic process and normalize ruling parties. Secondly, about how Team Proposition is far less likely to get systematic change within these countries. And thirdly, about the impact on functional democracies by this motion. But before we get into any of that, let's take a look at what Team Proposition have said to us throughout this debate. So first, we want to take issue with the characterization that they've done throughout this debate when they talk about, being absolutely sure that these are only in countries where elections are completely rigged, right? And where it's definite that there's some kind of foul play happening here in terms of how the election cycle works, right? We think the motion itself says that this is where it's believed that there's some kind of tampering elections, and we think that expands to countries where it's potentially up in the air whether or not there is tampering in these elections, right? This looks like Hungary, which actually currently has fair elections, a country that they bring to you in their own example here. Yeah, and they also talk about how they think countries are slowly going to turn into, we're going to have a situation like Syria where this happens slowly over time, but we think that this actually happens a lot faster when you have no opposition fighting against the party that's currently in ruling power, right? We think actually having a party there fighting and participating in elections slows that down. So yeah, moving on to their first point here, where they talk about media coverage and how it doesn't exist in other countries when you're not boycotting this. We think that when a government runs for election and they win by an 80-20 split, and there's clearly a very large support for the opposition party, we think that media is more likely to cover it in that scenario, right? Because they're saying that, hey, something clearly went wrong here at the point where these elections were so skewed towards the party that's currently ruling, right? So we think that this entire mechanism that should bring us, no thank you, doesn't really apply here, because we think that we should get more coverage on our side at the point at which they're not being shut down by the ruling party and they actually have something to point at in terms of actual change. Actual results. But the second point they bring us is something about who can actually see the vote. This is going to clash in our constructive later on, but also they talk about delaying elections, and we think that Ultimately, if the government is so corrupt and have so much power that they can delay elections without any harm from the opposition, they're probably not having elections in the first place and not really caring about this. This looks like what happened in China, what happens, in any country that becomes dictatorship, but they just delay elections and stay in power. That's what team proposition gets on their side by their own constructive. So let's look at how we basically undermine belief in democratic process and normalize ruling parties. So we think that there's two types of people here and two issues here. So the first is, people who aren't that engaged in politics as it is, right? And they're not super invested in what the political system looks like, right? Your average person, more or less. So we think by not actually going into, by not actually running for, positions in parliament and, elections and stuff like that, you're actually giving ammunition to the ruling party to criticize and chastise the opposition party and saying that, oh, they're too scared to run, they don't have their act together, they can't actually put up a decent opposition against us, right? And we think that somewhat legitimizes, right, in the eyes of the average voter, the ruling party, right? But we think that this becomes far worse at the point at which most people start to normalize this ruling party having so much power when they can't actually vote for anyone else on that ballot, right? Because they're not that engaged. They're not really paying attention to the boycotts that much because they're not as engaged in politics, right? But the second issue here is that you don't actually flag how bad the system is under team proposition, right? Because you leave it to speculation because it's believed that there might be a flaw, but until you actually have that election and see voter turnout wasn't what it was meant to be, there isn't actually something to go off here, right? There's no real facts. No, thank you. So we think that the problem here is twofold. The first off, right, you're legitimizing this ruling party. You're making it harder for opposition to actually start fighting against the ruling party and the people have power, right? But secondly, you also get less push for change because people can't see this difference in outcomes, right? They can't see the difference between the polls and the actual election turnout and see that these don't actually match up and they don't correlate, right? And we think that at that point, you're going to start, losing this amount of support and amount of change, right? So we think that on both sides, the ruling party is probably a bit more it's probably more likely to win these elections because they do have, some amount of political power here. No, thank you. But we think the difference is that the opposition actually gets to run on their outside, right? So we think that there's a few impacts. The first is that, people don't, First is that people see opposition parties as more credible at the point at which they're actually on the political stage. They might be getting a few seats in parliament along the way, right? And they actually have all the status that comes along with being a parliamentarian, right? The second is people actually can call out the ruling party at the point at which they can see voter turnout and say, hey, something's gone wrong here, right? This isn't representative of how people voted or how I know people voted, and then actually have some kind of fact to base his criticism of. So we think that you're far more likely to actually get public pressure there. But thirdly, you also get rid of this normalization of the ruling power, right? Because people see that there is opposition to them. It's not just one party that's always running. So this, over time, what you essentially get is saying, oh, maybe we should vote for someone else. I keep seeing the same person, right? You're normalizing the power that currently exists. I'll take a POI.
So why can people figure out there's a difference between the polling and the eventual results, but they can't figure out that the turnout is much lower than what you would expect?
Okay, we think that people are probably going to notice that turnout's a bit lower, but we don't think that most people are really going to be swayed by this, right? Because the only people that you're really impacting are the very dedicated followers of that opposition party here, right? Everyone else who's in the middle, they kind of just show up to the polls, vote for whoever they sound likes the best, and at the point where they can't vote for the opposition, they're not really, voting. They're only voting for the current ruling party. So quickly on to my second point about how we get more systemic change under our side, right? So we think that most parties we think that most parties, are propped up. We think that there is some degree of opposition propped up by the ruling party at the point where they don't really seem like a complete dictator. So we think that this helps them legitimize themselves in the eyes of the people at the point where there's no actual opposition running for them, right? But we think that this is really problematic when the real opposition doesn't operate within the legal sphere, right? Doesn't operate within the grounds of elections. So you're pushing them outside of democracy when you're forcing them not to actually run run for things like votes and office. And we think that this gets far worse at the point where you end up with somewhere like Venezuela, where you have two governments running at the same time. And we think that that's the problem that you get when you're boycotting things like elections. We think it's far better to actually try and push for change, right? And this is important because the ruling power essentially keeps all of this power that they have. But at the point at which you can actually run, we think that you get two things. First off, some kind of legitimacy, because if you get one or two people in parliament, they actually, they can actually push for certain policies and have like a certain amount of gravitas in how they ask for change. But also secondly, right, you actually try, you actually get some kind of significant change in terms of who's in power. So for all the above reasons, stand with opposition.
Thank the speaker for their remarks. I now call upon the second proposition speaker to continue the proposition case.
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Mhm.
Perfect. Panel, the line between a fair democracy and one that is rigged is very thin. The problem with the issue with unfair democracies is that it is often incredibly hard to pinpoint where that change really happened. Far more often do we see an incredibly gradual change, step by step. Voter ID laws get changed, regions get gerrymandered, the state media becomes under grips of the incumbent government. Because this happens so slowly, it is never a headline, it is never on the front newspapers of the global media. There is a reason why I have never read about US gerrymandering in Dutch newspapers, and that is because when steps happen slowly, they don't enter the news. The thing is that there is a difference between those elections, and when that difference can be much more clearly pointed out because an opposition party simply chooses not to run, there will be way more attention. The internal politics of the country will realize something is wrong, and there will be much more pressure for things to change. In my speech, firstly, talking about the two large questions of this debate. That is to say, on what side of the House do we have more international support for change? And secondly, on what side of the House do we have more internal pressure to democratize? Lastly, my own constructive argument, talking about how opposition parties become complicit within the government and therefore embolden the autocratic regime. Okay, let's talk about international support. So we get like one large response from team opposition, which is to say that when you have a skewed result, an 80-20 outcome, there will be as much international attention. I think that this does not really engage with our argumentation because we say that 80-20 results are not necessarily proof of rigging. There's many elections, even in US history, where there have been landslides. That doesn't mean that there has been a rigged election. It's much harder for a newspaper to like get lots of eyeballs by simply being, oh, there was a slightly unfair result that you wouldn't really expect. It's much easier to get those eyeballs when one party simply refuses to engage with that democracy outright. And I don't think that that skewed result will be enough to attract that attention. I think the crux of this clash has become the characterization of these democracies. Actually, I'll take your point.
The mayoral elections in Istanbul were one of the largest news stories last year, where the opposition to Erdogan won. Why won't that happen under side up?
So I don't understand what you're on about. Like, I don't think that the elections in Israel were Istanbul were at the front pages of the newspaper. In fact, we've seen that in Turkey, Erdogan has slowly taken more and more power for himself, and nothing has happened. He still has domestic and international support, and no one has really done anything about it. So unless you can somehow prove that Erdogan is going to end in the next few months, I really think you need to choose a different example. Okay. Let's talk about the characterization of these regimes. That is to say, what we told you is two large things. Firstly, election rigging is not a sexy affair. In other words, often it's not just simply the fact that governments outright simply lie about the results. Often they simply implement like marginal but effective policies which don't outright seem like you're rigging that election. Things like gerrymandering, things like voter ID laws, but also things like controlling the state's media, or as we saw happen in Venezuela, not allowing international voters to really engage with the democratic process. None of these things really scream something that you think requires attention, but all these slowly add up to a election result not being fair. However, we think that it's much more sexy for an entire party to refuse to engage with that. It's one large news story which does immediately there is a problem with the democratic system. No, thank you. The second thing that we pointed out to you is that these small things happen over a large period of time. So there's never a tipping point, which is to say there's never one moment where a newspaper thinks this is the most important story of the day. Rather, it is always a story that happens on the last few pages of that newspaper, because never there is a major step happened towards autocracy. But when an opposition party chooses in one moment to step out, it does reach the front newspapers. We told you this specific characterization is vital to this debate, because for international support to actually happen, it can't simply be in the back pages of the international media. It has to be the first thing for international, foreign affairs to take priority within domestic elections and within domestic politics. So on our side, we're far more likely for people to actually create pressure upon their democratically elected governments to make sure that there are democratic elections in other countries, because they're more worried about that because they actually read about it. That means that we have more things like safety measures for protesters, we have more sanctions on illegitimate governments, and we have more things like recognizing people like Juan Guaido on our side of the house. Note that that only happened after the opposition party refused to run in a presidential election. So that says that about international pressure. But let's talk about the internal pressure to democratize, something Team Opposition wants to talk about. I think there are a few things the government says. Firstly, they say, well, the government can just say the opposition didn't even dare to run. But this is completely non-comparative, because if there's an 80-20 result, they could also say, look, the opposition tried to run, but they clearly completely failed. We're the best party. This doesn't stand. The second thing they say is that the opposition gains legitimacy. I have two responses. Firstly, I think that it's going to seem incredibly hypocritical for the opposition to even participate in that election, because if they knew that it was going to be rigged, and they also knew that it wasn't going to give them a fair shot, why would you engage in that process in the first place? Rather, you're going to seem like you're kind of hedge your bets, and then if your result doesn't come out, then is when you say that it was a rigged election and it seems unfair. People don't listen to losers. But secondly, I think that they become part of the broken system. More on that in my constructive. The third constructive that we get from Team Opposition is talking about the evidence we have that election rigging actually happened. And this is the crux of the debate, because they say people are going to know the difference between polling, but they're not going to know the difference between turnout. We told you that systematically the reverse is actually true. Not only because it's really easy for you to notice turnout. When one year suddenly you only see a few people outside the election booths rather than an entire line, you can easily notice that there is a problem, but you can't easily notice disconnections between voter polling and the actual outcomes that happen. But secondly, we think that people notice that there is no longer a choice on the ballot. This is a major thing. When you walk into an election booth and you only have the incumbent president, then you know that something is wrong, because in a democracy, you should always have choice. And I think this is more important because no longer do people care about partisan things, because they no longer look at the opposition as simple liars, because the more important thing to people than partisan politics is having democracy in the first place. Because of this, we have more internal pressure and we have more international pressure. So let's talk about being part of the system. The opposition emboldens the regime. Why do joining elections make you seem part of the system? Not only do you legitimize the election by joining it, but more importantly, you often do gain 1 or 2 seats in parliament. This is really problematic, because then you show up in all the media footage of that parliament. You often have photo opportunities with the incumbent president and things like this. Why does that embolden the dictator? I think that largely dictators are going to make sure the opposition has no real power. So they're going to have a really small minority, or they're going to be in an organ of the government that doesn't have real legislative authority. But they do give that dictator legitimacy in a few ways. Firstly, the parliament looks a lot more legitimate because there's an actual opposition. Imagine looking at footage of a parliament and there's literally no one fighting against the incumbent party. You're clearly going to think something is wrong. But otherwise, you also make all the policies that seem through the parliament seem more legitimate because the opposition has been a part of that decision process. For these reasons, I beg you to propose.
Okay, I thank the speaker for their remarks. I now call upon the second speaker from side opposition to continue the opposition case.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. In Texas, gerrymandering and ID laws are something really common when it comes to voting. Side prop wants to believe that most authoritarian states turn there slowly, but also want to ignore all the other democratic states that do the exact same that they want to claim. Then went to the point that the motion says believes that the elections are not free. We believe that the elections shouldn't have to be mandatorily not free. So before I talk to you in my speech why some countries that don't have an unfair democratic process will be worse off, let me rebut the main things brought up by side prop. So we have two classes thus far in this debate. One, helping democracies, and secondly, international pressure. So they, on the second speech, they backtrack a bit and they say that, well, now we're not only talking about authoritarian countries, but we're also talking about countries that slowly will turn authoritarian, right? And they give us this evidence. Countries turn slowly authoritarian when you have ID laws, when you have slow voter suppression, and when you have gerrymandering, right? This is something that happens to most democracies around the world, right? So to that point, we are not really certain about which democracies they are talking about, which makes their problems worse to the point that they cannot, no thank you, they cannot claim that they are only talking about Venezuela or that they are talking about really corrupt dictatorships. They also have then to argue for the democracies in Eastern Europe. They also have to argue for some democracies in Europe, in Central Europe, and also for many other cases, right? So we believe that they have really expanded the claim, right? But secondly, if it is something so slow, we don't get why just running just running in those elections, because then you have a fair chance of actually winning because it's a slow change, and actually taking power of the checks and balances won't actually do what side prop wants to claim. Now, second thing that they said under this class is basically that the opposition loses legitimacy to the point that they run in the election, right? So, so to that, we basically claim that facts about the election is what gains legitimacy, right? To the point that you're able to run, and to the point that you show to the people that you only got 20%, while polls were having you way higher. It is what gives you a legal ground to go to the Supreme Court and overturn it. That's what happened in Malawi when actually the elections were overturned. The opposition party actually won when they contested, which is exactly what side op wants to do. Right. Now they have this other mechanism about how people don't see other voters voting, and therefore they start claiming that the democracy isn't actually a democracy. So to that, we have two main responses. One, the leaders are actually, that they talked about, are really popular, right? They're talking about Viktor Orban, they're talking about Duterte, some of the most popular leaders in those countries. The voters would still go out and vote. You would see plenty of people in the polls. We don't find that mechanism working. Therefore, we don't even get how you get more public pressure. No, thank you. But secondly, even if, let's say, the society stops voting and people don't go to the polls, to the point that they say that societies are so broken that they will not pressure the governments in any way, even if we contest the elections are rigged and that they are actually happening, no thank you, then what is that public pressure that they're saying going to do at the end of the day on the side prop, right? That public pressure is just going to exist while as we explained in the first speech, you let the democratic process in those countries rot, right? Now, on the second class, we're on the international pressure, right? So basically they claim that those elections are not usually covered, and therefore that you lose prestige, right? And not prestige, that you lose press, sorry. So under that, we have four main responses, right? So first of all, when the elections is also contested, some that we have not done the comparative, we say to you that press still exists, right? It is really important if at the end of the day, the opposition to Viktor Orban comes out and says that the press is biased and therefore this election is not something important. This is something that will become really popular in the media. Right. Secondly, if you don't allow to have upsets, like exactly the mayoral elections in Istanbul that we had in the POI, it is what actually becomes huge news, right? This is when people were like, actually, Erdogan's power can be limited, and actually, democracy in Turkey can be restored and actually allowed for some international pressure, right? Thirdly, actually, very interesting, those elections, even if they don't have upsets, become really popular, right? It was a huge story when Viktor Orban's election was whether he will still maintain his majority or not. We believe that this still happens under both sides. We don't get why they're able to only claim it. And fourth and finally, if international pressure was so big, then why is Turkey or any other country for that matter, or Venezuela even, still a dictatorship, right? Because the US has really meddled in the politics of Venezuela, but they are still authoritarian as Op claims. We don't see how that public pressure changes them. So before I move on to my argumentation, I'll take your POI.
Do you think that Venezuela is closer to now getting a new democratic government than Turkey is now has zero international pressure?
First of all, Turkey has some international pressure. That's why there are many articles about them imprisoning journalists. But also, we say to you that no, Venezuela is not on the path of dictatorship. They're literally in the middle. They're in the midst of a civil war. We don't get how that is any positive towards your social cause, right? So, in this argument, we're going to talk to you on how some democrats that might be perceived as functional will lose their functionality, right? So the difference between the first speech and this argument is that in the first speech we talk to you about cases where they actually are not functional. In this one, we're talking to you the case that they are believed to be not functional, right? So which countries are we talking about? So why some countries might not be perfectly functional, but actually perceived as not be? Because maybe press isn't impartial, right? Because maybe the Supreme Court isn't independent, and maybe because leaders tend to be authoritarian, like Duterte or Viktor Orban, right? But the elections are fair and the opposition still exists. That's why they're still a democracy, just an illiberal democracy, right? So how, and again, this is why Duterte, no thank you, hasn't passed every legislation that he wanted. This is why Viktor Orban wasn't able to pass every legislation that he wanted. So how POP makes this worse? You leave the government party by itself, right? The leaders and the party have an incentive then to maximize their power, right? But now they are the ones that control almost every single check and balance, right? So they can dismantle the democratic process of that state. This is problematic for two reasons. One, you make limitations to the already existing democracy, but you control the police even tighter, so you don't allow for any protest. And secondly, you make the press even more biased, so no hit pieces or anything like that happens. Secondly, you have long-lasting damage, the point that you have more of a two-thirds majority, and you can change the constitution, and you have power over the Senate. Therefore, you're able to dismantle democracy in the long term, right? Now, what happens other side of where you contest? These democracies are still somewhat functional, right? So elections happen and the opposition parties win some seats, right? So they have more, so the government doesn't have a two-thirds majority. This means that the government does not have all the checks and balances, so they cannot overturn the constitution. We believe at this point, even at the best case scenario for POP, to the point that those leaders are really popular, any public support they claim won't hurt them. Any public protest won't hurt them. So for all of the above reasons, we beg you for side op.
Okay, I thank the speaker for their remarks, and I call upon the third proposition speaker to continue the proposition case.
Is he on mute? Yeah. Oh, can everyone hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, cool. panel, what we've explained to you over and over again is that the descent into autocracy is very slow. Turkey didn't suddenly lock down their borders and shut down the opposition on the street. It went slowly, one law at a time, people not noticing that suddenly they became more autocratic and autocratic. This happened in Poland, this happened in Hungary. But why is this important and why is this going to win this debate? We think that the problem that we pointed out to you is that often people are not aware that elections are unfair, that their leader is suddenly trying to turn into a dictator. We need a tipping point that's going to point out to people that you're not living in a democracy, that Orban isn't a fairly elected governor. That can only happen at the moment an election isn't democratic anymore, because there is only one option. That's what we do on side proposition. In my speech, I will ask 3 questions. Why will their alternative of contesting not work? Why is a boycott likely to show people that there's not a democracy? And thirdly, on what does international pressure do? But firstly, what's the comparative in this debate? Because they say, oh, but opposition can actually gain seats in parliament. I think that's a really unlikely comparative. We think the opposition will lose on either side of the house. Why? Because opposition parties are only likely to boycott at the moment they have reasonable suspicion and certainty that elections are rigged. So that even if more people vote for them, that it's likely going to be faked due to stuffed ballot boxes, etc. Given that it's going to be rigged, we think they will never get significant power on their side of the house because of rigged elections. But even if opposition comes in power, Lucas's third argument explains to you why that's incredibly bad. Team opposition didn't dignify this with a response at all, but it's crucial because at the moment you only have 2 seats in parliament for the opposition parties. That's a smokescreen because Orban can point to parliament and say, look, we have opposition. But in the meantime, anytime an autocratic law is passed, they say, oh, we have an opposition, but they didn't do anything because he slowly manipulates parliament. We think it's a smokescreen because it doesn't actually change anything because power is still in the hands of the autocratic leader. They needed to explain why it's necessarily a good thing. On to the real debate. First clash. Why is contesting after the elections not going to be successful? Because this is their main claim, right? Oh, we'll point out like fraudulent behavior afterwards and then it's going to be fine. Why is it not going to work? 3 reasons. First, we think the extra time you give them, you give the main party time to cover up their fraud, right? They're going to start an investigation that's probably going to be rigged because you give them time to cover their tracks. So we don't think that any investigation they start is going to be fair because dictators have a huge incentives to cover their tracks. But second of all, they say, oh, you can go to the Supreme Court. But hold on, the thing about unfair democracies is that the courts are rigged as well. So they talk about Hungary, but Orban has kicked out judges that were against him, right? So you can't go to the court as an opposition party because we're not talking about fair democracies. We're often talking about places where also the courts are rigged. So opposition parties can't do much here. But even if there's an investigation that somewhat represents fair numbers, we don't think they prove why that will lead to change. 2 reasons why it won't. First, people don't believe losers, right? They're not going to care because at the moment you lose an election and then say, oh, well, it was rigged, we should have won. People just think you're saying that because you're a sore loser. We saw that in the United States, right? After the Russia investigation against Trump, when the Democrats started it, people just thought it was a witch hunt because the Democrats were sore that they lost. We think it's not going to lead to any systematical change because people just think that they're sore losers. But second, even if people believe it, we don't think it will gather international attention because it's not a sexy topic. I will take you after this. That means it's likely that on their side, people aren't going to become aware of the problem of corruption in the first place. That takes out their benefits, right? Because people continue to believe that they live in a democracy, not pushing for structural change. I'll take your POI.
So you would rather have the Democratic Party not run this year against Trump?
No, I think that falls out of debate. It was an example to illustrate why people don't believe losers, but the United States isn't a dictatorship yet. Why is a second clash? Why is a boycott more likely to show people that they don't live in a democracy rather than weaken the opposition? They say if you don't run, the main party is going to say, look, they're too weak. But panel, that's not comparative because on their side, opposition's party is going to keep losing with insane little numbers. That means that people already think that the opposition is weak, right? So that's not comparative at all because on their side, they are also not a force to match the fraudulent government. We think, as we explained, that people in these weak democracies believe that they live in a democracy. They value democracy. Like in Poland and Hungary, people want to believe that they have some sort of choice to shape the government around them, right? People are scared of dictators. Given that they value democracy, we think that the opposition stepping down wakes them up and makes them want to preserve that democracy. 3 reasons. First, at the moment you, oh no, thank you, only have one option on your ballot box that contradicts the idea of democracy, right? Because you have no choice. Compare that to their side, that the opposition will run, it will be fraudulent, but people see that they have 2 options. The group they talk about, if people aren't that interested in politics, just assume that having multiple options means democracy because they're not going to read further into it. The only way to wake that group up is to only face them with the fact that only one person can gain power in that nation. Second, because of lower turnout rights, at the moment you see empty voting booths and see low turnout numbers, you think you show that it's less legitimate the government is in place because democracy is based on the majority rules. At the moment the majority doesn't even show up, that should ring a bell that this isn't a democracy to begin with. On their side of the house, they see a high turnout rate, but they also see rigged election results. So they think that the majority voted in favor of the main party. No, thank you. But thirdly, because we explained that opposition parties are likely going to ask for postponed elections or like an investigation. We explained to you how that like the main party is likely to turn that down because they want this election to happen. That's another red flag at the moment, that the main party doesn't even want to postpone elections or to like clear up any suspicion that it might be a rigged election. These are 3 reasons that will wake people up that they're not living in a democracy. On their side, you keep up the facade of having a democracy because you have options and you have campaigns. And like, yeah, the opposition will whine afterwards that it was rigged, but that's only because they lost. On our side of the house, we confront people. We give them the tipping point that this slow facade into an autocracy is going to stop. So we win on that alone. But second, we think international attention is also important, right? Because often these newly weak democracies are weak and they need international support. They need another tipping point. We explained to you how rigged elections happen all the time, with like an opposition accusing a rigged election. We also explained to you how it's likely the investigation that they come up after the election is going to be false. So it's not likely going to stir any fuss because it just makes it seem like it's fine. On our side of the house, we're not saying that dictatorships will suddenly disappear, but we think you gather enough attention for Western countries to justify intervening. Like the fact that the EU put sanctions on Russia and Venezuela. Sure, Venezuela is not perfect, nor is Russia, but we think we're stronger. We're a lot closer to fixing it because politicians become poor, because we can freeze their assets, because we can put economic sanctions on that. That can only happen if you brutally wake other countries up that this slow decay has happened without them noticing, right? We think this is crucial because you need international recognition as a newly formed government, which can only happen if they do. In the end, you turn it from a democracy into an autocracy very slow. On their side of the house, you keep up the facade that has been kept up for years and years and years, making it seem like all is fine. We need to do something radical and something grotesque to wake people up that the country that they live in isn't as free and fair as they thought it to be. The only way for you to do that is to vote proposition I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their remarks. I now call upon the opposition third to continue opposition case.
Can everybody hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. We think it's problematic for proposition to say that these opposition parties are hypocritical on our side, whereas on their side, a party that stands for democratic values, a party that argues for democracy and promotes the right to vote, literally rejects the chance to uphold that democracy by systemically changing that country from the inside, by having at least some seats in parliament that could make them have some sort of checks and balances on the current government. Under their side, these parties have failed all the supporters to the extent that that right that they value so much, their right to vote, is the right they take away from the people that supported them. 3 main clashes in my speech. First of all, on international pressure. Secondly, on internal pressure. And thirdly, on systemic change. Let's start with the first clash. Now, they've told us from the beginning that they consider international pressure the most important thing. That by slowly altering a democracy, you don't get media attention, and that sanctions and military interventions are the only way to change authoritarian countries. Now, we have, yes, We have 6 main responses in this clash. First of all, note that they're literally saying that it's worth it to turn authoritarian countries more authoritarian faster, thus harming people, harming the lives and the rights of people just for the sake of international media coverage. We don't think that's a fair trade-off. We don't want to risk people getting less rights for anything else. Second response is that this awareness already exists, no matter if the process is slow. This is evident by the examples they have been using, because we know Turkey is an illiberal democracy, because we know Hungary is an illiberal democracy, no matter how slow that process was. We are aware of that now. This disproves their whole point. Third response is that if these elections are so uninteresting as they have been portraying them, then even if some parties choose to boycott them, they wouldn't get attention anyway. What this means is that actually some people in the international front and some media do care to some extent about elections in illiberal democracies. This means, which moves me to my fourth response, that we actually never got an explanation on why this coverage would exist if some parties boycott the election, and it wouldn't if they contest that election afterwards. Why Malawi got so much international attention for overturning the results in court, and that wouldn't happen in other cases. Never got an explanation for that. Our fifth response is that even if they get more international attention, we're really missing the link of public in US understanding that Hungary is not a democracy to militarily intervening or imposing sanctions. We never got an explanation on why that would happen, right? But that moves me to my sixth response, is that even if all that argument is true, even if international countries impose sanctions or something like that, we actually never got told why this would work. We tell you that these countries care much more about internal pressure, because having publicity within their own country is what makes them hold their power. They care less about international publicity, exactly because they're not fully democratic, because they care about preserving the power they already have. This happens through internal pressure. Before I move on to talking about that, I will take a PI.
Do you not think international actions, like, for example, guaranteeing the safety of protesters with airstrikes, does allow people to apply more internal pressure on their government, specifically if that government has less money due to sanctions?
Can you rephrase?
So governments that have reduced funds due to sanctions and can't attack their protesters because the international community guarantees their safety, do you not think that also leads to more internal pressure allowing for change to happen?
Right. Note that the source of the internal pressure they're talking about is literally lowering people's living standards because they have less money. Even if that would cause more internal pressure, we are not okay with it. We don't want people being harmed for their government not giving them rights, because sanctions don't harm the government. Sanctions harm the people in that country. We're still not okay with that. Now, second clash is an internal pressure, which we have told you is the most impactful mechanism for change. Now, they've told us that people don't understand that democracy doesn't exist on their country. They've told us that when they're allowed to vote, they think democracy is the case. They've told us that by seeing lower turnout, they will somehow pressure their government into becoming more democratic, right? And we have 4 main responses in this clash. First of all, we fully agree that these people don't 100% understand the problems in their country. The reason behind that is because the ruling party is usually insanely popular. This is why Duterte in the Philippines has such a high rate of approval. This means that they would believe the government's rhetoric. They would believe that ruling party afterwards telling them that the reason why the other parties didn't run is because they know they would never have a chance of winning against us. What proposition takes away is actual proof that these elections would be rigged. And only with rhetoric, these people are never going to be convinced that their country is undemocratic, especially because they believe in that ruling party so much. Second response is that just on the whole thing about how if they're allowed to vote, they think a democracy exists, right? We actually tell you that under our side, when you are allowed to show your preference and you see that preference not being represented in the actual results, if you know that a lot of people around you voted for an opposition party, yet that it only got 2 seats, it's much easier to notice actual rigged elections. And no, low voter turnout is not a sign of being undemocratic. Italy has low voter turnouts. We don't see dictatorships happening. We don't see that association of people of low voter turnouts with an undemocratic nature. Their response is that exactly because these ruling parties are so popular, people wouldn't really be pushing for things like delays in elections. So that whole mechanism doesn't really stand. And our fourth response is that actually on our side, by giving these parties, these opposition parties, a platform which comes with any seat in parliament, we make them more able to talk about these issues, to talk about corruption, to talk about the undemocratic tendencies of that country. We make the people more aware of it. This is a platform they couldn't have on their side, exactly because of the issues they have acknowledged, issues with freedom of speech and press that exists in these countries. So practically, we win that clash, we get more internal pressure, more likely to change. Now let's talk about systemic change. Note that all of proposition's arguments are reliant on some sort of pressure and perception. They never actually talked about ability to get change, which is something we have brought to you on 2 main arguments, right? So on that point, they've told us that pretty much that these parties will have no real power. And we have 2 main responses. First of all, this literally contradicts the thing they were saying about how people don't realize the issue. Because if a party gets elected, if a party has representatives in parliament, but has no ability to influence decisions, that is something people would probably notice because they know that they voted for that party, yet they see their opinion never counting. This is much easier to notice in that instance than not seeing that other party existing at all. Second response is that the entire, exactly what I said in the beginning, that their entire case was based on public perception and not our ability to get change. We tell you that by having some seats on the comparative, we get more of an ability to affect change than they do. And that's enough for us because we protect more people, because we check that government a bit more, because we make sure that at least this extension of falling into a dictatorship will happen slower. This is enough for us to win this debate for all the above reasons.
Okay, I thank the speaker for their remarks. I now call upon the opposition reply speaker to conclude the debate for the opposition team.
Okay. Sorry. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, side proposition has based its debate on the premise that every election is 100% unfair and there's no real gray area in the world in terms of what these elections look like. Hungary isn't Belarus and Viktor Orban doesn't have all the power, right? He isn't a dictator yet, right? And precisely because opposition parties actually run in the status quo, they actually fight against this. On Side Up, we told you in the first place, in the first speech, about how we actually, team proposition makes the situation way worse and how they, consolidate this power, right? So I'm going to bring you 2 clashes in my reply. First about, consolidation of power and democratic change, and secondly about loss of democracy, and secondly about the mechanisms for change that have actually been brought up throughout this debate. So in our first speech, we bring you 2 mechanisms. Here, right? So the first about, how people actually start, to normalize having one government in power, right? Because this is the point at which you get used to there only being one name on that ballot, right? You get used to there only being one actual view expressed in parliament because that becomes your status quo when there's no opposition there to take parliament seats, right? When there's no opposition there to actually run against someone, right? And team proposition's main reply to this is that it comes about over time, and that this slow change and shift of power away from a democratic system to a more authoritarian one happens over time. But the only reason it happens over time is because there's opposition there in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. This is what we've been telling you. Because you have someone there to actually question the authority of the ruling party, to actually put them in their place and say, hey, something's going wrong here, and slow down whatever is happening in that country. Team Proposition is giving up the fight by saying that opposition should just boycott these elections, right? They're fine with this change happening way faster, because at the point where your only criticism is, we think the elections were rigged, so we didn't show up this year, it's a lot easier for the ruling party to take that power and run with it, right? To actually, get to a point where they have the majority here. And we also brought you Panayi's point about how you're harming, democracies that aren't quite at the authoritarian state, right? Aren't quite so bad yet, right? And note how this clashes with, their second point about incumbents, right? And having, presidents there already and like stuff like that. And this is important because we prevent that incumbent from being there in the first place, right? Because we have that opposition there throughout. Hungary is a perfect example for this, because in order for Viktor Orban to make constitutional change to his country, he needs a 2/3 majority. And that 1/3 actually rests on our side of the house when you're actually fighting in the opposition to prevent change, to prevent your country from falling into an authoritarian grip. So we think that under our side of the house, we actually better serve democracy here. And we think it's outrageous to stand with side proposition, who are perfectly fine with letting this change happen way faster on their side, right? But let's actually look at the mechanism for change that we brought you here. So this is our second argument about how people actually push from the inside in terms of, having certain positions in parliament to actually fight for, policy change and policy shift. But we also told you about how you can actually have legitimacy in your fight, at the point where you can point at the election and say, we think these were rigged, let's launch an investigation, right? Let's see what the courts have to say about this, let's actually see what's going on here, when you have substantive proof to actually point out some kind of change. Team Prop only talks to you about international media coverage, something which exists under our side because it's just as outrageous when an opposition party actually gets a seat in parliament. It's just as outrageous when they criticize elections, right? What Team Proposition brings you for change is things like sanctions, right? Which means that the people of this country, right, the people who are, suffering under what is slowly becoming authoritarian rule, are actually being starved out here, because that's what sanctions do, right? They prevent things like imports in the first place. So we think what Team Proposition actually does is they harm people without giving them a mechanism for change, because there's no opposition for them to actually vote for here. So, ladies and gentlemen, for all the above reasons, right, because we actually bring you some kind of a mechanism of change, because we actually push to some degree here in terms of protecting democracy, side with Team Opposition.
Okay, I thank the speaker for their remarks, and I now call upon the reply speaker from side proposition to conclude the debate.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Opposition is probably right that in a fully functioning democracy, it's not so smart to take away an opposition party. But that's not the debate. The debate is about countries where there's already a rigged election, where the opposition already has no chance of winning, and whether or not the opposition then should participate in an illegitimate and abusive system. In the best case of side opposition, people massively vote in an opposition party. We told you from the start it doesn't matter, because the election is rigged, and therefore the opposition can never get the chance to actually change the system. We would rather have the opposition party then stepping out of the illegitimate system and chasing from the outside, because that's the only way you get the international and internal pressure to do so. Before I move on to the two main clashes in this debate, firstly on internal, secondly on international pressure, 3 points of strategical housekeeping. Firstly, note how all the engagement comes in free opposition, how an entire speech is new material. We think this is too late to credit, but even if you give credit to the speech, Note how she never explains how opposition parties are actually likely to get into power on their side of the house. We tell you this is the underlying assumption to all of their analysis. At the moment, they fail to prove that. We take this debate alone. But secondly, they fail to see the context of the debate itself. They are talking about a gray area where there might be a little bit of rigging, but people are still able to win. We told you from the beginning, these parties will only boycott if they're absolutely certain the election is rigged. What does it mean? It means these parties can't go to the Supreme Court at the moment they lose. It means they can't get in parliament because the elections are rigged. It means opposition's gray zones don't exist. They do not have a stronghold to ever get change in those countries. Lastly, note how they completely failed to engage with Lucas's argument. How they explained why even in opposition's best case, where parties actually go into these parliaments, actually get seats, how that makes them seem like way more illegitimate and way less popular because they participate in a system that never helped the public. Let's move on to internal change. Note how 3 oppositions spent 5 minutes giving new material about Prussia and still failed to explain how opposition parties actually get power. Note that we told you this only happens if it definitely rigged. But even if opposition parties get it, they never get the majority. Orban has an incentive to make sure opposition parties never get a full 1/3. Therefore, because it's not in the interest of the leading party. Therefore, opposition case doesn't work in this debate at all. However, we told you what the actual problem in these countries were. We told you how the public itself doesn't want to believe it's living in a dictatorship because it lives under the assumption that because they can think 2 boxes, because they think that there is an opposition party, they fail to see the reality of their power being slowly taken away from them. We therefore tell you that the only way to get the public pressure opposition wants to talk about is by making sure people see that what the actual problem in their society is. We tell you that is the moment you get to protest. That's the moment where in this failing democracy that are not strong enough to withhold without public support, where you get the actual change. That is how, after a failed election, you can actually make sure you vote an opposition party in. But even if you don't believe that, we told you from the start how we get international pressure and how you need international pressure to make sure people actually have the means to stand up, because it's the way you make sure you protect the protesters. It's a means you're actually able to give targeted sanctions to dictators like is happening in Venezuela right now. We told you how you need a radical move to show the tipping point to authoritarian regimes, how you need to have media coverage. And sure, there might be a media article about a certain election, but in order to get to the front page, you need a radical action like stepping out of an election at all. In the end, we tell you opposition parties won't have power in parliament anyway, and the only way to ever make sure this situation gets better is on our side. So proud to propose.
Excellent. I thank all speakers for a really good debate. And we, the judges, will actually be taken somewhere else. So relax, and we will be back as soon as we can while I'm inviting the host to help us out here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the debate.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are 2 teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.